Good evening to everyone. Welcome to our midweek service again. So good to see everyone, and we're thankful for your presence. As we've already heard in the announcement, there's several that need our prayers and aren't able to be with us, but we also have several that are able to be back with us after traveling or sickness or other issues, and so we're thankful for that. And I hope that our time together will be beneficial, of course, for all of us, and most of all, glorifying to God. I'll continue the series that I've been engaging in most times that I speak on Wednesday nights. That is covering book by book the books of the Bible in an overview type fashion. Most recently, we covered the book of 1 Kings, and tonight, Lord willing, we'll cover the book of 2 Kings. It hasn't been too long since that lesson, so we'll review 1 Kings very quickly. Remember, 1 Kings essentially picks up at the very end of David's life and continues the history, the story of Israel. It tells us a great deal about Solomon and the building of the temple. But then after that, after Solomon's reign, and because of Solomon's folly, God had promised that the kingdom was going to be taken away and divided. And so during the reign of his son Rehoboam, and some foolish choices that he made, led to that division. And so we had the 10 northern tribes of Israel that separated and become their own. They set up Jeroboam as their king. Rehoboam remained the king of Judah and Benjamin, what would be essentially the nation of Judah. And from that time forward, there were going to be two nations. And so we saw that. We also saw the rise, especially of the prophetic role. Now, there have been many prophets throughout the Old Testament already, but we see especially during the times of the kings and with the rise of Elijah, this prominence of the role of prophet. And so with that, we come then to the book of 2 Kings. You might also recall that originally in the Hebrew Bible, this was all one really long work. And so in the Septuagint and then in the English Bibles, that has been broken up a little bit. But really, there's just kind of a false division there. It's just a continuation of the story as we get into what we consider 2 Kings. Now, 2 Kings is going to cover a little bit more time period than what we covered in the book of 1 Kings. From the time that we pick up at the very end of Elijah's life, the beginning of Elisha's ministry, and it's going to go forward about 300 years. And that's going to cover the existence of both kingdoms and also tell us about both kingdoms as they are carried off into captivity. Now, when it comes to an outline, it's kind of hard to come up with a real specific outline. There's not really what you might call a lot of thematic changes in the book. It continues to tell stories. So I've seen several different outlines of the book of 2 Kings. This is one I've kind of adapted from a couple of sources. I would divide basically the first section up into the first 17 chapters that tell us the story, the continued story of Israel and Judah together. But by the time we get to the end of chapter 17, we have the nation of Israel. Their punishment has come about. They've been carried off into captivity by Assyria and essentially destroyed as a nation. And so then those final 7 or 8 chapters, chapters 18 through 25, focus on just the kingdom of Judah. They outlive the kingdom of Israel for almost another century and a half, but ultimately they go down the same road of Israel, and that is a road of immorality, a road of idolatry and rebellion, and ultimately they too are punished, not by Assyria, but they will be captivated by Babylon, who was the world power at that time. Then you can see there on the outline a few subdivisions of this. Really, one of the biggest sections of this book tells us about Elisha. That's the protege of Elijah. It's easy to get those two mixed up. Elijah comes first, and then Elisha comes after him. And the first 8 chapters, or 7.5 chapters, really focus on Elisha. And so not even really about the kings. Now we have some of the interaction of Elisha and the kings, but we read a lot about Elisha. And then we just bounce back and forth between the kings of Israel and Judah and their reigns. And then at the end of chapter 17, we read about the continued decline and ultimate fall of Israel. And then in the second half, as we're looking at just the kings of Judah, we pick up with Hezekiah. Now, when Hezekiah became king, and we'll talk more about Hezekiah, the nation had an evil king in his father, but Hezekiah led a great restoration. Hezekiah was a very righteous king, and so we read about his reforming and restoring the kingdom. But after him, his son and grandson, Manasseh and Amon, were evil men. In fact, Manasseh was a very, very evil king for most of his life. And so we read about his apostasy. But there is another righteous king. There's one more righteous king to come. And so Josiah, we're told about in chapters 22 and 23. And he brings in some great restoration, some great reforming of the kingdom. But then those final few chapters tell us about the final and ultimate decline of Judah as well. So that's a simple outline. If you like outlines, if they help you understand the larger structure of the book, then I hope that that will help you. As we look at the kings of Israel and Judah, we had a chart like this last time, and you'll notice the names that are in bold, those are kings that are righteous kings, or at least mostly righteous kings. Now, one of the things you'll see when you read through 1st and 2nd Kings is you do have some kings who were good, but they weren't completely good. There were things that they could have done better. Or you have some kings that started off really good, but then by the end of their reign, they had gone and chosen some wrong ways, kind of like Solomon had done. But by and large, these names that are in the bold font are righteous kings. And so when we've picked up in the book of 2 Kings, there's Jehoram and Ahaziah. Now, Ahaziah, when he dies, his mother is Athaliah. And if I'm not mistaken, Athaliah is actually the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And she is a wicked, wicked woman. And she actually, when her son Ahaziah dies, she tried to kill off the rest of the royal family. She killed almost all of her family in an attempt to seize power for herself. But there were some that saved Joash, who was just a little boy at the time. He would have been about 1 year old. And so they saved him from her. And 6 years later, when he's 7 years old, there's a coup against Queen Athaliah. And this 7-year-old boy is made king. She is deposed and she is executed. And that brought in an era of one of the longest standing times of righteous kingship. We'll come back to this slide in a second. But we have Joash and his son Amaziah and his son Azariah, who has a very long reign. And then Jotham were all mostly righteous, good kings. And so a succession of 4 consecutive kings. You'd think that you'd get more than that, but that really is about as good as it gets in the history of these people. But that's an interesting picture because you have such a dark time in Judah's history where you've got Jehoram and Ahaziah had been wicked men. They'd been wicked kings. Queen Athaliah had been incredibly wicked. But out of that, there comes a restoration where Judah enjoys one of the longest periods of righteous kings and of righteous activity. And that's an encouragement, I hope, to us. And we'll see that a time or two again that we may be able to remark about. There are certainly dark times and there are difficult times as mankind goes through history. There have been times of great wickedness and great immorality or great idolatry. And sometimes God's people find themselves living in such times. And maybe we feel like we're living in such a time, or maybe we don't. We look at the world, though, and I think we see a lot of bad things. We see a lot of dangerous things. We see a lot of wicked things. That doesn't mean that the righteous can't still be righteous, and it doesn't mean that the righteous can't have an impact. We don't know how history will play out in the future. And it could be that there can be a great awakening, that there can be a great restoration, and that more people come to obey God. And Israel's history itself is a reminder that even after dark days, there can be days of greatness for God's people. Now you'll notice in Israel, however, there are no names that are bolded. Again, like we mentioned last time, in 1 Kings, there were no righteous kings in Israel, and there are no righteous kings of Israel in 2 Kings. That means Israel never had a righteous king. Now they had the potential to. Jeroboam, the very first king of Israel, had a great start. And he ended up leading the country into idolatry. A man that we'll talk a little bit about tonight, Jehu, he had a great start. He was a man who was zealous for the Lord in some ways. But ultimately, he wouldn't make the restorations and reformations needed. And so none of the kings of Israel were righteous. There's the remaining list. Of course, after Jotham, there is Ahaz, who goes after the ways of Israel, but then that will bring in Hezekiah. But you'll notice the names kind of start switching back and forth for Judah. Israel ends during Ahaz's reign. just constant turnover of kings and governors. And finally, in the early 700 BCs, they are destroyed by Assyria. Judah goes on for a little while, but after Josiah, there are no more righteous kings for Judah either. And by the end of the book, we have them in captivity by the foreign oppressor Babylon. Now, what I want to do, and we'll go through these, we won't get to talk about a lot of the details of these stories, but really I just want to focus on a few of the main individuals. Instead of trying to go through and recap or retell every story throughout the book of 2 Kings, I just want to highlight a few of the prominent individuals. And we've already highlighted them at least a little bit, but we'll focus a tad bit more for the remainder of our thoughts tonight. First of all, of course, is Elisha. If you remember, after Elijah had defeated the prophets of Baal back in 1 Kings, but then he got worried because Jezebel had vowed that she was going to remove his head from his body. And he ran away and he was frightened. Well, if you read that story, what God leads him to after that encounter where God speaks to him out in the wilderness, he leads him to find this man Elisha. And Elisha begins following Elijah and kind of becomes his pupil or his student, his protege. But it's one of those things that while Elijah was a powerful prophet, and Elijah, in fact, even became kind of the symbol of the prophets in the Jewish mind. But when you read the stories, Elisha actually ends up kind of outshining Elijah, at least in some of his miracles. And we have a lot of stories that are told to us about Elisha. There's stories about purifying bitter waters. There's kind of an interesting story about an Israelite or a Jew who had lost his axe head that was borrowed, and he was able to make that axe head float to the top of the water. Of course, there's his relationship that he had with a woman, a Shunammite woman, who was very hospitable and who treated him well, and her family treated him well. They were very hospitable and formed a friendship. She ended up having a son. That woman's son, although got sick at one point and died, but Elisha was able to raise that child from the dead. An incredibly and powerful miracle. Now, one of the probably most famous stories that we know of from Elisha is over there in chapter 5. And if you'll remember that, the Syrians at that point are at war constantly with Israel. By the way, Elijah and Israel really focus on Israel, the northern kingdoms. But Syria has been at war with Israel quite a bit. They have this commander named Naaman, who is a great and a powerful man, but he is a leper. He has leprosy. That's a death sentence back in those days. But there's a little Israelite girl who had been captured during one of the Syrian raids. She's actually a servant to Naaman. And she remembers that there's prophets in Israel, and there's a prophet that could help her master. He must have been a decent fellow, at least to some degree, for his own servants to wish that he would get better and tell him the good news, that there's salvation for him available. That little girl is a wonderful example. And so he goes down to Israel. He's sent by the king of Syria down to Israel, and he goes to the king with this message that he wants to be healed of his leprosy. Well, the king of Israel, of course, is distraught. He thinks Syria is just trying to pick another fight. But Elisha sends a message to the king, and he tells him not to worry. Simply send Naaman down, and he'll take care of this. And so Naaman's on the way, and as he gets there, as he's approaching, some messengers come out and meet him. Elisha doesn't even come out and meet the man. And they say, the prophet tells you to go down to the Jordan River, and you dip 7 times. And he gets very upset. This isn't the grand big deal he thought it would be. This Israelite prophet should know better. He should have come out and waved his hands and done something miraculous and powerful and neat and interesting. And so he gets ready to leave in a huff. Thankfully, Naaman had some good advisors, and they tell him, look, if he would have told you to do some great feat, you would have tried to do it. So why not, when he tells you to do something as simple as go and dip in the Jordan 7 times, why not do it? And so the man decides to obey the voice of the prophet. And he goes down to the Jordan River, not nearly as nice or big or beautiful of a river as some of the rivers that he's used to, like the Abana and the Pharpar back there in Syria and in the area of Damascus. But he dips in the river once and twice and 3 and 4. And finally, on the 7th time, he comes up and his skin is made new. It's made whole. The man's leprosy has left him. And it's a beautiful and wonderful story of God's power, of the importance of obedience. The man returns to give thanks to Elisha, and he tries to pay him. Of course, Elisha won't take the money, but he becomes a convert, essentially. Now, he has to go back to Syria, and he has to fulfill his duties. But you can read there about basically his conviction that there is really only one true God, and that is the God of Israel. And again, this is one of those interesting things. This is taking place up in Israel. This isn't down in Jerusalem. This is up in Israel, where you've got all this paganism and you've got all this idolatry, and yet the faithful few. Elisha is greatly outnumbered by all the people that are not faithful to God in Israel. And yet here he is converting people to the one true God of Israel. Even though Israel's not acting the way they ought to, Elisha is still bringing people as he can to love and obey the God of Israel. I think that in and of itself is a powerful reminder for us that maybe sometimes people don't do what they ought to do. Maybe sometimes even in the church isn't what it ought to be. That should never discourage us from doing what we ought to do. And it should never discourage us from trying to share the gospel with those who are lost. The church may have problems. Now, I'm thankful that in our congregation, I think things are well. Not that we don't have room to grow and mature and continue to work. But I'm thankful we're not riddled with false doctrine and many of the problems that sometimes you hear about. But even if we were, you can continue to strive to do your best. And you can continue to share the gospel with the world. Elisha did that. And he had great results. He was able to convert this man from Syria. Now, there's some other incredible stories. We can't go into them. One of the others that are one of my favorites are there in chapter 6 and 8. There is, of course, one story where the Syrians are trying to march different places. And Elisha is told by God where the armies are. And so he sends to the king and he tells him, move your troops here, move them there. And the Syrians finally realize that their information is leaking. Now, the Syrian commander is positive that there's a spy. But someone tells him that's not a spy, it's this prophet. This prophet Elisha. He has the power of God behind him, and he's telling the king where we are. How they figured that out, I don't know. But the kings begin sending people to destroy Elisha. And there's that incredible scene where one morning they wake up, and one of Elisha's servants looks out the house, and he sees this city is surrounded by the Syrian army. Of course, he's terrified. Elisha's acting like there's no big deal, and he finally prays that this man's eyes be opened after telling him those who are with us are more than with them. Didn't look like that, but when Elisha prays that the man's eyes be opened, God grants this man to see behind the curtain that separates this world and the spiritual, and he can see this great army of Syria that's surrounding their city. And behind them, he sees this even greater army of horses and chariots of fire as an angelic army is poised to protect Elisha and protect God's people. We don't know every way in which God works. And I don't expect that we'll ever get our eyes opened on this side of eternity to see the angelic realm. We don't need to. We can have faith in the power of God that He's working for His people. He may not always save us dramatically the way that He has saved certain individuals throughout time. But what a powerful story from this Old Testament book to remind us that God is working and fighting for His people. And so we just need to be faithful to Him. He's able to deliver the army to the king. And interestingly, he doesn't have them destroyed or slaughtered. The king doesn't know if they should fight the soldiers when they're brought into the capital city, basically unable to defend themselves. And Elisha says no. He has the king feed them and treat them well and release them. And for a time after that, there's peace. And Israel is not troubled for at least a little while by Syria. Of course, a time comes when they do. And there's a story of the lepers who go out. There's a song that we sing about this. The lepers that go out and they find that the army has been destroyed. That's during Elisha's reign as well. You can read about that in chapter 7. And one of the last things about Elisha, when we read after chapter 7, we don't really read about him until he dies in chapter 13. But he's buried, and we're told just this kind of different random story about some men, some Moabite raiders, and during one of their quests, one of their men dies, and they throw the man into this pit, and it happens to be where Elisha's buried, and he touches the bones of Elisha, and the man comes back to life, and he's resurrected. And so there's some amazing and incredible stories about Elisha. I encourage you to read them and study them more. That will be a very beneficial character study. But let's also talk about Jehu. I mentioned Jehu a little while ago. Jehu is one of those men who to me is an unfortunate story. He's much like Jeroboam the first because he is a man who had great potential. Now, when Jehu is serving in the army of Israel, Ahab's family is still in control. One of his sons or grandsons is reigning. And so that it started with Omri, and then there was Ahab, and then two of his sons had lived, and they were all wicked. They were all evil. And God had promised all the way back during the life of Ahab and Jezebel that they were going to come to a violent and a bloody and a complete end. And Jehu is appointed as the next king of Israel, kind of like Saul had been foretold to be the next king or the first king, and then David was anointed to be the next king, and Jeroboam. Jehu has that type of start. A prophet comes and anoints him to be the next king and tells him what he is supposed to do when it comes to destroying the lineage of Ahab, and Jehu takes his job seriously. Now, the man was a violent man, but he was a warrior, and you can read about his story, how he hunted down every single one of Ahab's descendants, how he killed the kings, how he chased down Jezebel, and he had her killed. As he told one man, he was filled with zeal for the Lord. And it didn't stop with them. Now, by this point, Ahab and Jezebel had instituted Baal worship throughout Israel, and it was throughout the land. And he destroys that too. He didn't just get rid of the former kings and take his throne of power. He got rid of the Baal worship. In fact, he set up a trick. He called all the priests and people of Baal to come and have this great worship. And he even threatened, he said, if you don't come, I'm going to kill you for not coming. And actually what he was doing is he was waiting for all these priests to come, and then he killed them there. And so he slaughtered all of the priests of Baal. And he destroyed all of the temples that had been built for Baal. And he completely eradicated Baal worship to the best of his ability in the land of Israel. This man is doing some great things. He is destroying God's enemies. He is destroying false worship. He just needs to keep going. But what does he do? Does the exact same thing that Jeroboam had done. Once he gets into power, he decides to leave some things the way they are. And you remember those golden calves that Jeroboam set up, one in Dan and one down in Bethel, so that people wouldn't go back to Jerusalem to worship? Well, Jehu won't get rid of those. And he goes ahead and he allows and he permits that golden calf worship to take place. And so although the Baals have been taken care of, idolatry still reigns in Israel. And he set up a lineage that lasted for about longer than anybody else in Israel's history. I believe it went to the 4th generation after him. But for all of the good things he didn't do enough. And he still disobeyed God. This man could have righted the ship for Israel. This man could have changed Israel's history, and he was on the track to do so. But a good start is not enough because he didn't finish. Well, another individual that we have to talk about if we're talking about 2 Kings is Hezekiah. Now, this man's father had been a wicked man. He had followed the ways of Israel. He had done many evil things. In fact, we're told that he even was involved in child sacrifice. This is one of the great ironies of the Bible. I don't know if Hezekiah would have been the king. I don't know which child his father sacrificed. But it's possible that Hezekiah wouldn't have been the king of Judah had his father not sacrificed one of his other children. And so in this process, Hezekiah becomes king after his father dies. And his father has led Judah down a very dark path. And Hezekiah comes in and he rights the ship. He does what Jehu had done, except he does it fully. In fact, we'll read here in just a second a great commendation that God gives him. But he destroyed the high places, which, by the way, one of the things you'll read over and over again, even a lot of the good kings, they would worship the Lord right. They would follow the law of Moses. They wouldn't follow idols, but they would continue to allow the high places. That was something that was a knock against almost every king, but Hezekiah even destroyed the high places. He even destroyed a bronze serpent, and that bronze serpent was a famous item in Israel. That was the bronze serpent that Moses had built back during the years of wandering. You remember that story from Numbers when the people complained and God sent fiery serpents. And when those serpents bit people, they would die, and they called out to God for mercy. But instead of just sending the snakes away, he instructed Moses to build this bronze serpent and to erect it in the middle of the camp. And if anybody, when they were bit, would look to that serpent, God would heal them. Now, imagine what an impressive piece this was. It has survived from the time of Moses. You want to talk about a national treasure. This is it. This predates Solomon's temple. This predates David. This is something that the hands of Moses constructed. It's an impressive thing. But it became an idol. And the children of Israel, the Jews, had begun to worship it in a sense. And so Hezekiah takes this incredible national treasure and he destroys it. That was a risky move. That was probably an unpopular move. But this man showed his dedication to the Lord and that he would not allow anything to be worshipped other than God. What great dedication the man had. I want to read this about him. In verses 5 through 8 of 2 Kings 18, it says, "He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses." Now, towards the end of his life, there's another story that takes place for Hezekiah. Isaiah, the prophet, the one who wrote the book of Isaiah, he lives during the time of Hezekiah. He is sent by God to tell Hezekiah to get your family, your house in order, because you're going to die. And we read a prayer that Hezekiah uttered. By the way, I'm not going to read this, but go back to 1 Kings 19 when you get a chance and read. There's a prayer Hezekiah utters in response to the Assyrian threat. It's an incredible prayer, but also just a very short prayer. After he was told that he was going to die, he turned and we're told he prayed, "Now, O Lord, please remember how I have walked before you in faithfulness and with a whole heart and have done what is good in your sight." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. It's a very short prayer, very simple prayer, and what a powerful prayer. In fact, we're told that before Isaiah was even out of the courtyard of the palace, God spoke to Isaiah and said, "You go back to Hezekiah and you tell him I'm going to give him 15 more years." Now, this is an incredible prayer because it's so different than normal in this situation. How many times have you heard of people, or maybe we've been in this situation ourselves, or we were injured terribly, or we had some grave disease, or we know someone that did. And people begin to pray, "Lord, if you'll save me from this, if you'll take care of me, then I'll become a better person. I'll start being a better Christian. I'll start being better this, better that." Now, that's a wonderful thing to decide to do if you get more time. But Hezekiah didn't pray that way. Hezekiah simply said, "Lord, please remember how I've lived." He was able to say, "Don't give me more time so I can finally start being righteous." He was able to say, "Please remember how I've been righteous, how I've followed your ways, how I've been faithful." What an incredible ability to be able to say that prayer. That was Hezekiah. Unfortunately, in the last 15 years of his life, he made a couple of mistakes. And whether we can blame him too much for this one or not, I'm not sure. But a few years after that event, he had a son. And that son was going to become the next king of Israel, or of Judah, and that was King Manasseh. He began reigning when he was 12 years old. So he's born during the time after Hezekiah had been told he was going to die, but been granted 15 more years of life. But for some reason, Hezekiah failed to raise this son to be a righteous man, or he was influenced in other ways, because he became perhaps the most evil king in all of Judah's history. We're told, here's a couple of quotes. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. He behaved like the people that had been driven out because of their immorality and idolatry. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. He has done things more evil than all the Amorites did. We're told that Manasseh shed very much innocent blood. By the way, he partook in sacrifices to Molech. That was child sacrifice. And apparently to such a degree that the Bible said he shed very much innocent blood till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. This man was a vile, wicked man. And he brought in a dark period of history for Judah. Now, 2 Kings doesn't record this. 2 Kings just tells us these things and then kind of ends. But in 2 Chronicles, when we learn about Manasseh, we learn that God gets so angry that he allows Manasseh to be captured. The Assyrians have a war with them. They actually capture him. They carry him away with hooks and chains. And I won't describe exactly how all that probably happened, but it would have been graphic and violent and painful. And he's carted away as a prisoner. And we get to read this in 2 Chronicles 33. And when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty and heard his plea and brought him again to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. And he did his best to do better. In fact, he's tried to do away with many of the things he had instituted and he had set up. Unfortunately, his son, the damage had been done, and his son was going to be an evil king as well. But he tried to do better. He tried to change. But Manasseh is an incredible picture because he is a reminder that whatever you've done, however vile of a person you have been, however wicked you may be, if you have life, you have the opportunity to repent. And God does not look at a person's life and say, you know what? You've spent 20 years being evil. You've spent 60 years being evil. You know what? You've been more evil than anybody else that I can think of. I'm not going to grant you repentance. You've been too evil. When someone humbles themselves and repents and is ready to obey God, God is ready to forgive. Even Manasseh, perhaps arguably the worst of all the kings, he rivaled Ahab, may have been worse. He was forgiven when he humbled himself and repented. Unfortunately, like I said, his son was evil, continued many of the things that his father had started and tried to go back on, but ultimately he's killed and his son becomes king. And his son Josiah is 8 years old. Now, by the way, we've read about some kings. We've read about a king, Joash, who was 7 years old, of Manasseh, who was 12 years old. Of course, he was a failure for many years. And Josiah, who is 8 years old. Put that into perspective, Quade's 8 years old. That's a terrifying thought, to have an 8-year-old boy as your king. But Josiah becomes king and becomes right in line with Hezekiah and David, one of the greatest kings of Israel, of Judah. He repaired the temple during his reign. It had become in disrepair and not used properly, so he sets about a restoration project. And while they're there, and this is an amazing thing to think about, Israel had gotten so off track, they didn't even know the law of Moses. Now, when I read the Bible, I just always assume you've got Jews that know the law of Moses devoutly. But when Josiah is repairing the temple, they find this book, they find this scroll, and they bring it to him, and they find out it's the law. They found the Pentateuch. They found the books of Moses that contain the law. And they start reading it. And Josiah is smitten with grief when he sees what God's law was and what Judah had become. And so he enacts even more restorations. As they restore the temple, they restore proper worship. He abolishes, he actively goes out like Jehu had done And as Hezekiah done, and he gets rid of the wrong forms of worship. He destroys the child sacrifices in the temples. He removes all of the idols. He removes the mediums and the witches that had been there. And as he reads the law, he reads about things like Passover. They had not been observing Passover. They hadn't been keeping the Passover. But he reads it in the law, and so he restores the practice of Passover. So for the first time in who knows how many years, Judah is finally worshiping and following God the way they are supposed to. But unfortunately, he's the last righteous king. His son and his grandson, they're going to be evil. They're going to continue down this road of idolatry and sin. And ultimately, by the time we get to the end of the book, Judah is conquered by Babylon. Now, a couple of lessons that we've alluded to very briefly. First of all, a good start doesn't guarantee a good end. Remember that story of Jehu. You may be doing really well in your faith right now. Maybe you've gotten started really well, and that is wonderful and that's fantastic. Don't stop. Don't coast. Don't relax. To be faithful to God means to be faithful always. It means not just for a few years. It doesn't mean just put in your years of service and then take it easy. It means be faithful until death. Like we read about over in Revelation chapter 2. It is not enough to start strong. If we don't end well, if we don't end righteous, then we end separated from God. But on the other side, a bad start doesn't guarantee a bad end. Sometimes we look at people and we think they could never be a Christian. We think, look at how evil they are. Look at the things they've done in their life. They've ruined themselves. Oh, they haven't. At least they don't have to have. Because if they have life, they have opportunity. And they can change their ways if they choose to do so. Manasseh did. And if Manasseh could, anyone can. If they will humble themselves and obey God. You can. Whatever you've done, whatever evil has been in your life, you can have a good end. Now, one thing also that we see in the books of Kings is that a parent's deeds don't ensure the same for their children. And this, like these first 2 points, works both ways. Here's just a couple of examples. Remember, Joash was a very righteous man. His father was evil. His grandmother was evil. He was surrounded by evil except for some counselors that were righteous, and he became righteous. Sometimes we see families and we write off the younger generation, we write off the children because their parents are terrible people. Don't do that. And don't use the excuse that your parents weren't what they ought to be for you to not follow the Lord. It's up to you to follow the Lord. Maybe your parents weren't the examples they ought to be. Maybe they didn't teach you what they ought to teach you. But if you know the truth, you need to obey the truth, and you can. Your parents can't stop you from that. On the other hand, being a good person doesn't ensure that your children will be. Hezekiah was an incredibly righteous man, as we saw. His son was the worst king Judah ever saw until he repented at the very end of his life. That's a scary reminder. Our children are not going to be righteous just because we are righteous. Now, I don't know. Maybe Hezekiah didn't train his son as well as he ought to. I'm not sure what happened. But it's a reminder that we can't rest easy because we're doing our job individually if we're not actually training them. And also, we can't rest on the laurels of our parents. Just because our folks were good, righteous people doesn't mean therein we are saved. We must behave correctly ourselves. And there's some other examples there. But also, lastly, the book of 2 Kings shows a picture, alludes to the reminder that God's plans will not be stopped. Here's the final verses of 2 Kings. This is, Judah is in captivity. It says, in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison, and he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs as long as he lived. Now that may sound like a strange paragraph. Nothing really theologically deep there. But that's how the book of 2 Kings ends. That's the end of 2 Kings. That's the end, essentially, of the history of Israel until we get to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Why is this important? Because remember, at the end of 2 Kings, Israel as a nation is decimated. The 10 northern tribes are gone. Judah's gone. Jerusalem's been destroyed. The temple's been destroyed. And the king is in captivity. Now, why is that such a big deal? I mean, it's bad for Israelites, right? But remember, God had made some promises. God had promised David that from him was going to come one of his descendants who would establish an eternal, everlasting kingdom. There's barely anything of a kingdom left. The kingdom's gone. The king's in captivity. But the king's alive. And this note that the book of 2 Kings ends on brings in this glimmer of hope in the destruction of God's people that reminds the reader, but they're not gone. God's promises haven't failed. There is still a king. The lineage still exists. And God is going to fulfill his promises. Mankind may do everything in his power to thwart God's plans. Many men may not be what they ought to be, but God's promises will come to fruition. After Jehoiachin, he will have children and children and children, and generations will continue on until we get to Jesus. And the king comes and establishes the kingdom that God had promised. Probably didn't look like that was a possibility when Israelites and Jews were being marched off to captivity. But God's plans will not be stopped. And the book of 2 Kings alludes to that fact in the very final verses. Well, there's a lot of other things in the book of 2 Kings, a lot of stories, a lot of details. I encourage you to go and read and study that book, and I hope that this has given you a foundation to do so, and maybe some encouragement to go and do so. But that is the book of 2 Kings. As we bring the study to a close, we have an opportunity to extend the gospel invitation. Perhaps there's someone here who needs to obey that. As we've seen in examples tonight, whatever your past, whatever your lot, if you're ready to obey God, he's ready to wash you of your sins. So if you believe in Jesus as the Son of God and are ready to repent of your sins, confess Jesus, and it's time to be baptized for the remission of your sins. And God will forgive you, he will wash your sins away, and you will be added to his kingdom, the kingdom of his dear Son. Or if you're a Christian and you desire the prayers of the church on your behalf, we stand ready and willing to pray with you and for you. So we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.